Ladies and gentlemen, Devio or Sajjano, a very good afternoon to all of you and welcome to this exciting webinar being organized by the Center of Excellence on Alternative Dispute Resolution at the Faculty of Law, Manav Rachna University. My name is Ajay Thomas and I'm the Director of the Faculty of Law at this university. Most of you know about us, but to those few who do not know about Manav Rachna University and its Faculty of Law, we are a very young law school located in the Aravalli Hills in Surajkund, right on the border of Delhi and Haryana. The law school is a foundation member of the prestigious LSAC Global Law Alliance, which is a group of leading Indian private law colleges and universities. Right now, we just rolled into our third year of operations, and besides offering 3 streams of the 5-year integrated LLB honors program, we also offer LLM and PhD programs. The theme for today's webinar is very exciting, ladies and gentlemen. Weathering the storm, energy disputes, the energy transition, and impact of COVID-19. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be a deep dive into the regulations, the law, economics, and policy driving the international energy sector. And in terms of a format, this webinar to a large extent will be essentially a fireside chat between one of my brightest colleagues and an energy expert who functions at the intersection of law, policy, and economics. Our distinguished speaker, ladies and gentlemen, for today is Professor Raphael Heffron. He's a professor for global energy law and sustainability at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral Law and Policy at the University of Dundee. Now, this center to a large extent is better known by its abbreviation CEPMLP. So those of you who see CEPMLP, you know that that's the institution that Professor Heffron teaches at right now. So for those of you wondering about where in the world is this place called Dundee, I am quite sure many of you in India have never heard of this place called Dundee, but ladies and gentlemen, you must visit this place. It's a beautiful riverside city located in the central lowlands of Scotland. 10 years ago, I did have the opportunity of visiting Dundee and the center, and I must let you know, especially the students in the audience, this center is one of the best places to study and specialize in energy laws. So ladies and gentlemen, do remember CEPMLP, that's the place if you want to specialize in energy laws. Now coming back to Professor Heffron, he's a qualified barrister at law and was called to the bar in the Republic of Ireland. He read for his PhD at Trinity Hall, University of Cambridge, and holds degrees from the University of Cambridge, MPhil and PhD, the University of Oxford, MSc, the University of St. Andrews, just besides the place where golf originated, ladies and gentlemen. So Professor Heffron got his master's in literature from St. Andrews, and he holds a BA and MA from Trinity College, Dublin. His work, ladies and gentlemen, has a principal focus on achieving a just transition to a low carbon economy, and he combines a mix of energy law, policy, and economics. He has published over 120 publications of different types, and I have great pleasure in letting you know that he is today one of the, or if not the most cited scholars in the field in this area of the law. His research and teachings have been recognized by the award of a Jean Monnet professorship by the European Commission, not once, but twice. He's also a senior fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He's a research associate at the National UK Energy Research Centre. He has given expert advice to the European Union, the World Bank, the United Nations, and various international think tanks. Professor Heffron is on the editorial board of the International Energy Law Review and is a consulting editor of the Halsbury's Laws of England for the volumes on energy law. Ladies and gentlemen, the list of accolades, positions, and honors goes on. And what I have read to you is only an illustrative list and not an exhaustive list. All of which just goes to show how honored we are as organizers to have Professor Heffron as our distinguished speaker today. After that not so brief introduction of our distinguished speaker, may I now invite my colleague, Shashikant Yadav, Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Law at Manav Rachna University, to moderate this session. Now, before I hand over the session to the moderator, here's a brief little bit about him. Shashikant is an Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Law at Manav Rachna University. He is an oil and gas specialist with years of industry and teaching experience. He's associated also with the University of Dundee as a visiting academic researcher. And more importantly, is a recognized scholar with the Center for Social Legal Studies at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on unconventional hydrocarbon resources and application of the precautionary principle, and his work has been published in numerous reputed international journals. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you my colleague, Shashikant Yadav. Shashi, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Thomas, sir, for your generous introduction. And thank you very much, Professor Heffron, for joining in and for cooperating with us with all the audiovisual facilities therein. So before starting with the concept note, or before handing over the presenter or the mic to Professor Heffron, let me just throw some light on the concept of what we are discussing today. And I will take briefly 5 minutes to present that. And while doing so, I will concentrate on various dimensions of energy law, because it's a very niche-based and domain-specific learning for most of us in India, where we don't have an expertise center as we have back in UK, which is CEPMLP. So as we know, energy is in a value-based system chain is a multidimensional sector. We have state actors and we have non-state actors interacting with each other while doing a decision-making in energy. So we will have a project proponent, we will have communities, we will have regulators from government who come together, and of course the parliamentarian in case of democracy, who come together and regulate energy and make laws on energy sector. However, the basic theme of energy lawmaking and energy regulation depends on the basic fabric on which a country runs. So for example, in India, the coal is regulated through public purposes, whereas oil and gas, the laws on it are always a balance between business interest and public purposes. So we don't have much subsidies on petroleum and diesels, whereas we have a lot of subsidies on coal and kerosene. Now, how will we come up with such decision making, that how we'll make such public purpose domain specific laws, or how will we make business interest specific laws all over the world, all over the communities, is the question which we need to ascertain right now. Moreover, a new kind of theme is appearing all across the world when it comes to nuclear energy and unconventional resources, where we make laws on the basis of risk assessment rather than public purpose or business interest. We see that what are the risks in implementing these sources, and then only we will make law according to that. So basically, in nuclear law, we have specific laws for the disposal of nuclear material, which is the major concern. And for unconventional hydrocarbon, the debate is still on how to make it more sustainable. So unlike coal and oil and gas, we are still struggling how to exploit and explore those opportunities. And when I talk about these controls, I'm not only talking about Indian context, I'm talking about context all over the world. So let me just give you two examples on how energy transition or energy law affects all over the world. For example, all of us must be aware about the Paris commitment under United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, the Paris commitment says that there has to be less emission of carbon in the world. It's as simple as that. Now, how we are going to do that? We are going to do that by making sure that the energy production should be more sustainable. And to do so, we need to make sure that we have technologies at hand to make sure that less carbon is emitted. For example, if we have thermal power plants in India, and if 1 unit of coal burns and emit 10 units of carbon, we need to get technology to reduce it to 5. And those technology and innovation mostly happens in developed countries where we have that kind of funding. Now, how to get that in developing countries where a lot of carbon emissions are happening? And that is one of the major challenge which was there in UNFCCC and Paris commitment as well. The second major challenge was how to make that technology transfer done. How would an environmentally sustainable technology be transferred to India without burdening the energy production with more finances? Because we need to remember, we have patent law in place and we need to pay a lot of royalties to get those technologies. And so we have TRIPS, trade-related aspect of intellectual property rights, in which Article 7 says that there has to be technological dissemination or transfer therein. And we see the success that has happened due to generic medicines in India, where reverse engineering or compulsory licensing was allowed. So can something like that be done from environmental point of view? So these are the local, regional, and international issues which we face when it comes to transition of energy. And if I have to sum up the whole concept of today's discussion, there are two main focal points, which is how energy transition will happen in the world. And we need to transfer ourselves from high carbon sources to low carbon sources. Now, what kind of policy should it be in place to do so? And second is how energy intensity should be sustainable in India. Now, energy intensity is basically energy consumption, energy supply divided by gross domestic product, GDP of India. Now, how to make that sustainable is the second question. Now, with these two questions in mind, I'll hand over the mic to Professor Heffron to throw some light on the nature and emerging trends of energy regulation in law, and probably later on talk about the impact of COVID-19 and scope of energy law as budding lawyers and researchers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So can you hear me clearly?
Yes, Professor Heffron.
Okay, so thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this webinar, and thank you very much to Professor Thomas for the very good introduction to my bio, and very complimentary. So I'm going to speak to the title and I'm going to identify, I suppose, a number of issues around energy disputes, talk about the energy transition, talk about COVID-19, climate change, and also give a few, I suppose, suggestions around, for those interested, maybe why you may take energy law as a career. So I will go through these issues very fast, and I would say that there are some links in the presentation that anyone who's interested, can contact me, and I'll be happy to send on some of that information. So it's already been explained who I am, so I won't spend too long, but it was good that Professor Thomas asked, well, where is CEPMLP that I work for? So it's up there, the red dot, the very top of Scotland in the United Kingdom. And as Professor Thomas quite rightly identified, coming to visit Dundee is, a beautiful place. And you can see all these different rankings have said, Dundee is one of the top places to visit in the world. And you can even see the one in the corner saying that Dundee is ranked ahead of even tropical islands as a place to visit. So Professor Thomas was quite correct in saying that you should all try and take a visit when all the, let's say, the COVID-19 crisis is over. But when you are thinking of that trip, you can come along and not only see beautiful Dundee, but you can also visit us at our 43-year-old Energy Law and Policy Centre. So we have been going for 43 years. We have had students from over 140 different countries around the world. So we have a good representation of our students working in the energy industry all over the world. And I think currently we have several former alumni who are serving in parliaments in different countries as the energy minister. So a good education can be had here at Dundee. And I'd also like to highlight a recent publication series that we've launched, an academic journal, Global Energy Law and Sustainability. And you can find that online. Anyone who is interested, again, can get in touch with me about that, or if they have article submissions, etc. I'm the editor of that journal. So I want to begin by talking a very small bit about how the world is changing. And I want to highlight this figure that you can see here. 44 trillion in new energy investment will happen by 2040. That is in new energy investment, not taking into account investment that may go into existing energy infrastructure. So if you imagine that 44 trillion will be spent by 2040, you can think as a lawyer or a student who is trying to think about what to do, there is going to be lots and lots of opportunities in the area of energy law. Increasingly, it'll be a growing, industry, and growing much faster than it has before. And you can also see the figure at the bottom there, circa 10% of global GDP is energy related. And if we think about this in simple economic terms, we could say that 1 out of every $10 spent in the world is energy related expenditure. The only other sector as big as this is the health sector. So, really energy is an area where there is going to remain and going to be jobs in the future. And when we think of the sort of energy issues, and one of the points I want to make, what is the legal connection into this big energy sector? And we can see more and more there is an interest in having justice in this energy sector. So we can see all across the world, India is no exception, and all across the world there have been big energy related accidents, and generally companies have not always contributed properly to cleaning up after those accidents. And we can see here in Nature, one of the biggest journals, or the biggest journal in the world for academics, they focus more and more on this justice issue, and that they call for more research on energy and justice. And again, we can see the same in these very high profile interdisciplinary energy journals. And maybe 10 years ago, some of these journals didn't really accept energy law or legal articles, but it was very rare to have legal articles, and maybe that's partly the legal community weren't publishing and connecting with the energy community. But more and more now you see a focus on justice in all of these journals, and they do want more articles on energy justice related issues. And we can think of, when we talk of the energy sector, we can think of the broader effect of the energy sector, and that goes up to 75 trillion. And, we can think of maybe the impact of COVID-19 here. Is this going to result in change? What is the change that will happen in terms of COVID-19? Will it affect these amounts of money or expenditure in the energy sector? Well, we can also, I think, as was mentioned earlier in one of the introduction speeches, we think about a global movement, and we already can see a global movement in terms of energy that is focused around the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have Sustainable Development Goal number 7 on energy. And in research published 2 years ago, they showed that if you solve the energy Sustainable Development Goal, that is key to resolving all the other Sustainable Development Goals, so all the other 16 Sustainable Development Goals. So when we think of ourselves, we can see, that the world is very much changing at the moment. It has already changed to some degree before COVID-19 came along. And I think that's one of the key messages that I want to get across, that we have seen a lot of change already. And what COVID-19 will do is accelerate some of that change. And one of the areas we can see already is around the mobile phone. We all have mobile phones, and the mobile phone has rare metals inside. And these rare metals you can see here this is a diagram of a global supply chain for cobalt coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then products being made in Asia and then sold in different markets around the world. But we can see here the interlinkages around a supply chain, and we can think of all the various issues, and we can do this. We are beginning to do this for the whole energy sector. So we are realizing what are the impacts in terms of the environment as a result of the energy sector. Where is the money going from the energy sector, from these energy products? Who is receiving the money? And we can begin to see exactly how fair are energy markets. And that is a big question the energy community is asking today. And I want to highlight a few examples where some countries are taking steps even further. So in a judgment in Australia, the judge refused the opening of a coal mine. And the reason, or a part of the reason he refused it, was because he did not want Australia to be responsible for carbon dioxide emissions that would result from burning coal that had been extracted in Australia but sold in other countries. And I believe, some Australian coal ends up being burnt in India. So we think this is a landmark judgment where the judge is thinking about the impact of their own energy sector and thinking of the impact on other places in the world. And in a similar way, it's not just happening in developed countries. We also see in Kenya, for slightly similar reasons, a coal project was rejected in Kenya. And we can think of, it's already been mentioned around the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And we can think, to me, one of the reasons this is very important is because 188 countries have already signed and ratified the Paris Agreement. So as a lawyer, we sometimes think of international law as either hard or soft law. And if it's soft law, we tend to think it's weaker. And while Paris COP21 agreement for many people will be soft law, my belief is it is a piece of hard law, because so many countries have signed up to it. Never before have so many countries signed up to a international agreement so fast and ratified it as well. And we think because of the sheer volume of countries that have signed up to it, it is creating an impact already. And we think of the annual climate change negotiations, and we can think of, whether you are a climate change believer or denier. You can think that, the reality is when we talk about the issues around climate change, we are trying to make the world a better place. So what is wrong with trying to make the world a better place? And you can see the list there. What we are trying to do is have green jobs, sustainability, livable cities, clean water, healthy children, You know, that's what we are aiming for when we think of that broader climate goal as a result of fixing the energy system. So we think of COVID-19 and we can think what is going to be the impact over the next few years. And it is going to have a big impact on the energy sector. You know, when we have a crisis, people become usually more risk conservative. They don't want to take as much risk. So how will that affect the energy sector and society going forward? And what I would argue is already we have seen many things happen since the last economic crisis of 2007 to 2009. And it is my view and my assertion that this last economic crisis is still impacting society. We had a lot of reforms back then, and we will continue to have major reforms into the future. And COVID-19 will even highlight these even further as the world becomes more risk averse. And here is an infographic that I made, and you can see some of these risks we talk about. And, you know, you can see the risks in the center there. You know, they've made different types of energy projects very hard to build. And these risks are, you can see, are over the 4 phases of the project development: planning, construction, operation, decommissioning. Well, you can see all these risks. I'll just read them out quickly: project finance, environmental impact assessments, rules of foreign investment, rise in technology, Paris Agreement, economics, taxation, disclosure and transparency. And I won't go into them all today, but I will give a flavour. I will highlight a few of them about what has been happening. And you can see here on disclosure and transparency, there has been many tax leaks that resulted, in essence, after the last financial crisis. And this has showed how different companies have been exploiting international tax practices to ensure that they end up with the money, the majority of the money, rather than people who live near energy operations, or rather than governments receiving a greater share through taxation. And as we think of COVID-19, we will think that many governments will want more money to help rebuild their economies. And they should be looking at, are the energy markets in their country fairly set up? And this leads into issues of inequality, which, you know, is the energy system fair? And we can think inequality has been an area studied by major economists. Stiglitz and Jan Tirole there are both winners of the Nobel Prize in economics, and Piketty will probably win one in a few years. And he also has a further book out on issues around inequality. So we can see change happening in terms of economics already. We can also see change around data production, this particular focus on health. And we can estimate around the world there are 4.6 trillion is lost every year. That's 6.2% of global economic output. If you translated that to one country and you said every year you lose around 6% of your economic output, well, another way to get economic growth is to reduce that 6% loss as a result of pollution. So if you're struggling to get economic growth, another way is to reduce pollution and therefore reduce the negative economic impact of pollution. And also, in terms of the health, you can see another interesting data: 9 million premature deaths. That's 16% of all global deaths. So nearly 20%, 1 out of every 5 people will die prematurely as a result of pollution. And obviously, in a major way, the energy sector contributes to that pollution. So that is, again, why we need the change. And as part of that Paris Agreement in 2015, there was mention of a just transition. So when we think of the energy transition happening currently, we want that transition to be just. We want it to be fair. And that was contained in the Paris Agreement. And when we think of this just transition to a low carbon economy, we're thinking about a whole societal shift. And we want to think a bit more about interdisciplinary thinking. How are our labour markets going to be set up in the future? Our health systems, our general industrial policy, how is that going to be set up and established? But as lawyers, we think, what does this word just mean in terms of this transition to a low carbon economy? And when we think of this word just, we think it has many different forms of justice they combine to make up what this word justice, what we're looking for. And what we are looking for is distributive justice. We're looking for procedural justice. We're looking for recognition justice. We're looking for restorative justice. And just as a final one, we can think here of the magazine Cosmopolitan, or we can think of the cocktail Cosmopolitan, which many people will be having here in the UK on a Friday evening later tonight. But we think, the word cosmopolitan has been in some way being destroyed by the view of the cocktail and the magazine. But the reality is cosmopolitan. We also want cosmopolitan justice. And the idea behind cosmopolitan justice, it's a very old philosophy, the 3rd century BC, so well over 2,000 years old. People have been writing about cosmopolitan philosophy. And that's the idea contained with that is, the philosopher said, I am a citizen of the world. So we're thinking we are world citizens. We all have a role to play in this just transition to a low carbon economy. And we need to think broader than just what's happening in our own country. And as I said, at the start, we think about global supply chains. We are thinking about what is the impact of something that happens in our country, what is the impact as it happens in other countries. And again, one thing that is good that has happened recently is in the G7 talks, so those powerful countries, the politicians in their statement highlighted also that they needed to ensure a just transition. So what have some countries been doing about it? They've been establishing new just transition commissions, which are designed to ensure that there is a transition happening, and they decide how will this transition take place? What will be the legal changes that are needed to ensure that this transition will take place? And you can see here one in Germany, they want to end coal by 2038, and they are planning to put 1.3 billion per year for 20 years in order to achieve this objective. So we think of this transition to a low carbon economy, and it is in essence the greatest societal challenge of our time, and all of us are involved. We all have a role to play. But the question we can ask, is enough happening in the energy sector to date? And I just want to give an example, talk a very small bit about energy disputes. And here are some statistics, and I have mapped these out. And you can see here where energy disputes have been taking place in the energy sector. And you can see the different countries. And if you look at a lot of these countries, this is where the energy operations are happening. And if you look at these, many of these countries are what we call class as developing nations. So this is where the energy is being extracted. And if you look at the change in terms of this slide, this is where the energy companies are from. And you can see that shift. If I flick forward and back, you can see that shift moving from, in essence, developing countries to developed countries. So we can say, when we think of this just transition to a low carbon economy, there is a major problem in that the ownership, the assets, the money is going from the developing world, in essence, to the developed world. So how are we going to achieve this if we don't have the balance right? And you can also see from this map several tax havens: Panama, British Virgin Island, Bermuda, the Netherlands, why are these countries being used in terms of by investors? And in essence, it's to avoid the payment of taxation to governments. So when we think of energy law, what we need, and we think of those disputes happening, what we need is, a more grounded legislation or more grounded guidance for energy lawyers and judges to be able to make decisions and to correct the energy system. So here is a selection of energy principles, and this is work from several authors from around the world and myself. It's available for free online, and we advance 7 principles that should act as guidance for lawyers and judges in making making decisions on the energy sector. And here is an example, one example of where we talked about some of those principles at the European Courts of Justice with the lead European judges back in 2018. So trying to get that new principle guidance into operation in practice. And I will just then finally highlight a few points about visibility, and I'll go back to the story of the mobile phone. And with mobile phones, we can all see different images. And one thing we have to think about when we think about, disputes, we think about the energy sector, we have to think, nearly 80% of people will be living in cities, I think, by 2030 and 2040. So there is a shift that has been taking place for some time, people going from rural areas into urban areas. So what is the technology? What is the energy that is going to provide these big cities with all this energy needs? And that is generally low carbon technology. And we need to make sure that in terms of cities, we don't lock into old conventional energy, which is becoming a bit more expensive because low carbon technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper. And we want to make sure we aren't building these old style energy projects because they mean that we have to commit to coal for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, rather than investing in cheaper low carbon energy, which is clean and can provide more jobs than conventional energy sources. But also in cities, we are seeing, major problems as a result of the energy sector and as a result of climate change. And you can see here in Venice, a city that is flooded, and this relates to part of the earlier risks I talked about. We think about insurance, and it becomes increasingly hard for businesses to open in different cities around the world because they are suffering repeated effects of climate change. And I read recently that there was major floods in one city or region in India during the week. And we will see more and more of these events. And I'd give you, a highlight, one further example. This is a sort of image, it may not come up too clearly, of Jakarta in Indonesia, so one of the largest cities in the world with a greater population of 28 million people. It was announced last year Jakarta will be underwater by 2050. And they announced also last year they are relocating the capital of Indonesia to another area of the country. So we think that huge operation of moving 28 million people out of the city of Jakarta by 2050, when the city will be underwater. So that is going to cost a lot of money. It's going to devalue property prices, make things much harder to do in Jakarta because no one will, you won't be able to get business insurance to operate. But we'll see a major effect of climate change, and this is again why governments are taking action and need to take action in a much faster way. So I'll finish there, and anyone who wants some of the papers, I'll be happy to share. And I leave you there with my email address, but also with a quote, and again, to encourage those people to ensure that you should try and set your target higher, and you will hopefully be able to meet that higher target. And that is a quote from Michelangelo that I hope inspires some of you to achieve your goals even more. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Heffron. Indeed, we touched upon a lot of crucial matters related to energy transition, and I understand it's very difficult to touch upon such complicated matters within a lucid way. Thank you very much for presenting it in a very lucid manner so that anyone can comprehend and understand how energy transition is happening and why it is needed at grassroots as well as international levels. I have a few questions which, if you may agree, I would put forward. If we can take it for the discussions therein. Some are from the presentation, some are from our attendees, and I'll take roughly 15 to 20 minutes and try and wind it up according to the responses. So one of the first questions, which I think is pretty relevant from Indian context, is about pollution. And since you mentioned that when we talk about pollution, and if we reduce it, we'll end up saving the economy. Now, this is an assertion which is very convoluted for Indians. And we understand that something which is not polluting has to be expensive. The water treatment plants, the technology, the carbon storage, all these technologies has to be expensive. It will increase the cost of project proponent, eventually increasing the cost of the utilities and then affecting the whole economy. Now, this is the notion, linear notion with which we understand the whole framework. And just before getting the response, just to add on, we have a latest environmental impact assessment notification 2020, which eases the environment clearance in India. And in fact, there can be energy projects in India which will not require environment clearance at all. So that point, that how pollution can affect economy, can be very important in Indian context. Would you like to throw some light on that?
Yeah, just to say first that I would be very, very interested to learn more about those changes around the EIA legislation, in a conversation in future. But what I would say is, when we think about some of those changes, we do need to think about, are there foreign companies involved in those projects? And just because some of the legislation may have been relaxed in India, we need to think about that idea of cosmopolitan justice, where you're thinking, what is the, you have the view of you being a world citizen. What is the impact across the border, different borders? And we think there is a level of responsibility on a foreign investor or a foreign owned company operating in India, that they should have to apply the same legislation in their home jurisdiction as they would have to apply in India. So I think that is definitely a space to watch, to see, because I think we are seeing these foreign companies being held to account more in their home jurisdictions. So I think that's definitely an area to watch. In relation to your other point in terms of the cost, to me, when we get told about the different costs and things are expensive or other things are cheap, I think we need to realign and reevaluate how the costs are calculated. And we need to challenge the costs that are coming out from government, from the private sector. Are these genuinely the costs? And that's why in one of the examples that I would encourage people to read about is the Kenyan example and also the Australian example that I gave. And part of the problem in both those cases was the companies involved had overestimated or underestimated the costs and environmental impacts to, in essence, suit their agenda. And as we have, I mentioned also we have more availability of data. So we were, the people in the courts were able to challenge this data being provided by the private sector, and they could show these clear overestimations or underestimations. And I think when we get told something is expensive or cheap, and it's polluting, I think we need to go back and see, okay, where is this information coming from? What is the data? Is it reliable? Because what I would say is the energy transition is happening, and part of the reason it's happening is because, like any market, a market evolves, and we had a market, the energy market, that didn't evolve for many, many years. It majorly relied on coal, oil, and gas. And now we are seeing the change. We finally have a few new competitors. And you can see the transformation. Let's say if you look at your mobile phone, should we go back to using the big mobile phones in the 1980s? Why would we want to use old technology? We want to use the new technology. And this new technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper. And that is the real drive of the energy transition. And if you want data on the costing of low carbon energy sources and how, in particular, wind or solar are getting very cheap, I would encourage you can go and read International Energy Agency data, and also Bloomberg produce very good and reliable data on the future costs.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Heffron. There are two points that I would like to add from Indian context in reflection to your response. The first one would be, as you suggest, that the liability should be same as of the home country when the project proponent is from abroad. For example, in India, we recently saw a gas release, something not of that magnitude of Bhopal gas, but something similar happened in India, where a poisonous gas released in one of the southern states. And it's a South Korean company, and we realized the environment clearance was still pending, but the company was operating. Now, if we go to South Korean laws with respect to that, the liability was much more than Indian laws. And probably that is where we understand, when you talk about how economy from developing country to developed countries moving, those two graphs which you show, which very well comprehend the same situation in India. The second reflection that I would like to make with respect to is valuation. Indian Supreme Court, in fact, came up with a judgment where it came up with a valuation method. And we see valuation from a very capitalistic point of view. We do not evaluate the resources from social cost or the cost of making a project from migration or from displacement. So these accounts are not taken into consideration. And this was not happening in India, unfortunately, till 2018. In 2018, we came up with a new Land Act in which we integrated the cost of migration. So if we prepare a big dam, we integrate those costs, come into the valuation as well. So there is a positive note therein, but we need to see the implementation, still need to see the light of the day with respect to that valuation in India. Another important question, which also one of the attendees have posed and I also have in mind, is IPR as a barrier for technology transfer. We have seen in case of generic medicines, there have been advancements because of IPR. But when it comes to environmentally sustainable technology, Article 7 of the TRIPS technology transfer and reverse engineering, we see a lot of energy related or low carbon related advancement happening in developed countries, and developing countries are still relying on old technologies because they can't afford and they cannot innovate. So do you think there can be a solution to the whole conundrum which we are facing now?
Yes, I mean, I think in terms of technology transfer, the Paris Agreement was, one of the aims within that agreement was that we should see a greater technology transfer from developed to developing countries. We have not yet seen that take place to the, let's say, the aim. It hasn't achieved 100% of the aims that were contained in the Paris Agreement or the surrounding initiatives. But we are seeing, we are seeing some impact. It needs to happen faster, and it needs to happen in a bigger way. Unfortunately, because of, let's say, the current global economy and the way it's set up, I don't see too much hope for, massive change. But where I do see the hope is in the technology, because I think if we think of a combination of new energy technology, we think of a combination of the availability of, capital, where it's becoming less risky to make an investment in low carbon and more risky to make an investment in, fossil fuels. And I also think the point around data, where we are, already we are beginning to use artificial intelligence to analyze energy data. And that will mean that we are able to make huge gains in terms of energy efficiency and whether industries are energy intensive, and even ourselves, how we use energy at the home. So there are some studies and some practical experiments that have been conducted that by utilizing low carbon energy, particularly wind and solar in cities, combining it with artificial intelligence, you can reduce energy consumption by 60%. So some of these trials that have taken place, the technology is there, but they aren't able to change the electricity legislation in the country or in that city, because the current energy companies are obviously going to lose business. I mean, if you're talking about a city using 100% energy currently and being reduced by 60%, you're talking about several energy companies going out of business. So that is the game-changing environment that we are in, and that, increasingly the technology is there, but these companies aren't able to get access to the market. So that's, for me, where I hold out some hope that this technology, if it can be given access to the markets, it can transform how we use energy and how much we use.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Heffron, for the response. Now, I have 3 more questions, and with respect to your response, I have an important question in mind. We hear a lot about how a carbon market is evolving across the world, and carbon is being stocked, and it has a price now in international market. How do you place carbon market in the whole transition? Do you think carbon market, carbon trading, and carbon credit plays an important role in low carbon energy transition? And how do you see developing economies like India adopting carbon credit or carbon market as a regulation to improve the energy justice situation therein?
Well, I think carbon markets, they can they definitely can work, and you can see a few examples of how they successfully work in different countries around the world. They are challenging to begin, and I think in terms to operate and set the prices is a big challenge, and what the price is set at. But my view is that carbon markets should increasingly be seen as a way of, this is about essentially restorative justice. They should be seen as a way of making the energy company pay some of the cost for the pollution that they are doing. And I think in light of COVID-19, we think about all economies around the world needing finance. And this is another way of raising revenue. By having this carbon tax, you can raise, your taxation, national taxation revenue. So I would believe countries should be more progressive on this, on developing carbon markets, and developing carbon markets for all, different industries. And I think it's another way to raise revenue for what is, let's say, some damaging activity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the response, Professor. Just one reflection to this. In India, we have carbon tax in place on coal specifically, and the historical evolution of the tax was that all the money collected from that tax will go into river cleansing process and cleaning river, and all these diversions will be made from that fund. In between, we diverted those funds into GST, which is a new taxation scheme, to create buffer account for businesses who were struggling, but I think we are back in that direction. So I think it's a very important for attendees as well. It's a very important subject to research on, which is carbon credit and market and taxation in India in those response. My second last question would be regarding energy justice in developing economies. So you talk about the energy transition, and that transition has to have a component of justice. Not just a component, but justice should be the very much fulcrum of that particular transition. However, seeing the trend all over the world, the ranking and the kind of governing system, the accountability of governing system is questionable around the world when it comes to environmental matters. In that situation, how difficult it is to implement environmental justice, A, and secondly, you also mentioned about access to data to challenge the discretionary power or the regulations or the laws which are not just in nature. And you gave an example that how access to data is very much implemented in developed economies, but in developing economies like India, access of data is still a struggle. So how do you think that access of data plays an important role, and how to improve that? Just quick comments. It's exactly not a question, but kind of a reflection from you that what are the takeaways? How can we improve energy justice, and how is it linked from data access as per se?
Well, some quick answers. I mean, how can we improve justice in the energy sector? I mean, very quickly we can think about those different forms of justice that I talked about. Distributive, procedural, etc. And we can begin to say, okay, what do they mean for let's say the coal industry in India? We need to get the voice out there about what does justice mean in this particular energy sector, and we need people like you to be writing about this. We need to get the articles published and out there, and that feeds into in the same way to the point on data and data access. I mean, initially, I know that sometimes data may be hard to get access to, but in terms of the energy company who's building a project, I mean, they have to provide the data for the EIA. And what I would say is we and others in the energy community have to look at that data that has been provided and challenge it. How did they calculate it? How did they analyze it? You know, if I'm not saying that this happened, but if I say that there's public approval for a project, and before I say I interviewed people in the area and I received 100% public approval. So what would happen if I went into a coffee shop or a type of bar and I bought everyone a round of coffees? I'm sure if after they are drinking their coffee and I come up and say, well, do you approve of the project? I will get yeses all around. And then I put that in my report. Yes, I have public approval 100%. So, I mean, that type of where did the data come from? How was it collected? This is all the stuff that needs to be challenged. While we may lack our own data, and as you say, in a developing country, getting other types of data to compare may be difficult to do. But what we can challenge is these companies need to provide us with better data, and they need to demonstrate how they got it. Was it independently connected? So to give you an example that, you know, to me, some of these issues, they happen in developed world and developing countries. And it's only recently in new environmental impact legislation that the experts who collected your data had to prove they were independent. Because all over the world, what you had was a company employing what was a consultancy, an environmental consultancy, for example, which was full of ex-employees of the company. So they had retired from let's say, they had retired from the energy company, and they now had a consultancy job. And then they're re-employed to be a consultant to say, these are all the things you should do to save the environment. So I mean, clearly there were many conflicts, and it's only very recently that they changed the legislation in many countries to say you have to prove the independence of the experts. So we may not, in many developing countries, there may not be the same data that is produced by, let's say, environmental agencies that you get, let's say, you know, the US, until President Trump came along, the US Environmental Protection Agency produced a lot of very good and reliable data. But, you know, many countries, we don't fund our environmental protection agencies to the same extent. So I think what we can do is challenge how the data is collected, recorded, and used in the report.
Thank you very much. Just two quick observations. As I understand, an important development is shifting the burden of proof in case of conflict of interest to the regulators and to the consultant of the project proponents is essential to understand what kind of policies is coming and getting implemented. Another observation in case of hydraulic fracturing, which is my area of research, and when I was trying to get data in India, because we're still in exploration stage, the only thing I could do is to do a comparative analysis with the European Union or the United States, which is in the most advanced stage, and they have their reports out, and then probably come up with a comparative metrics, where I would argue that these are the things which have happened in the US, which is the most developed country when it comes to fracking. And if India says that they have advanced to another level, without any data when it comes to protection of water and water resources, they need to come up with answers. So I think comparative methodologies, as you suggest, can be an important tool when it comes to accountability and data access if we don't have the primary data at hand. And the last question is I had a different question, but I would take one of the attendees' question, which I think comprehensively meant that can you see renewable energies taking the bulk of the energy basket, specifically in developing economies? This is one of the most common questions which we get, that what kind of sharehold which will have from the renewable sources. For example, in India, renewable account only to 20 to 25%. Different study give different percentages. Do you think renewable energy has that potential?
Yeah, I mean, I do think renewable energy has that potential to go to potentially 60 to 80%. And I think when it's about combining the renewable energy with the other types of energy technology we have. So, I mentioned the artificial intelligence, and you can also think of the role of battery storage. So if battery storage can be done for cheaper and cheaper, and one thing I saw in a report recently is that they are trying to use less, metals in the new forms of battery technology. And I think if batteries became more affordable, we need a lot more financial and government support to subsidize them to make sure that they can enter the market fully. But if they were more affordable, I think they can achieve that 60-80%. And arguably, if each house or city had a big energy storage facility, I mean, then again, that can change the nature of the energy system. So things are a lot driven by price and cost, and we need governments to step out and maybe subsidize these companies. And what we have seen, unfortunately, is too often over the last 10 years, and it's another area that we have seen disputes on, is in the energy sector, is on the withdrawal of subsidy schemes for renewable energy. And as a result, the company sued the government. But why do we not give these new technologies more support around the world? And why are we continuing to support the older style technology? So to me, we should be supporting the new technology. And just maybe as a final point in terms of talking about COVID-19, when we think about the relationship between energy and health, if I said to you, take a 20-year-old vaccine when there's a new one available, you would say, why can't I have the new one? It's available. And we should be thinking about the energy sector in the same way. Why would we take the old technology when the new technology is available and it's better for us? The same way the new vaccine will be better for us than the 20-year-old one. So we should be challenging this from a market-driven performance and product-driven, and not just thinking about old versus new energy.
Thank you very much. And as I understand, there has to be economy of scale. When we increase the scale, as you suggested, market-driven, of renewable energy, the cost gets down and everything increases. Just on a final note, what kind of advice would you give? And it's a selfish question for budding researcher and energy lawyers like me. One advice which you would give to us.
I suppose the one advice is, I think, particularly in the energy sector, we need to challenge the information that is coming from government or from companies. And I think we have to realize whether we're talking about legislation, we're talking about the reports from judges, in terms of disputes, we have to see what are they relying on. And I think to go back to the point on disputes, you have to look at what is written, what is the judge relying on, and to me, I think, are these grounded in principles of justice? And we have to say, why, is the global energy sector, why is it not a fair market? I mean, the energy market has been operating for over nearly 200 years, and it still isn't a fair system. So my word of advice is, we have to challenge this information and become, let's say, thought leaders. We have to help the energy sector, and I believe we can do that if we provide more challenging opinion on legislation and judicial decisions and energy company documents and what they produce, such as in environmental impact assessments.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for reaffirming my own belief, Professor Heffron. And thank you very much for your time and patiently answering all the questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. Over to you, Professor Thomas.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was I'm just checking. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Excellent. So that was an excellent insight, or if I may say, an overview into the regulations, law, economics, and the policy driving the international energy sector. It was also nice to know about the impact and the potential impact that COVID-19 has and will have on the sector. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this very interesting, fascinating, if I may say, for me, insight into the energy sector, because I must admit that I truly stand enlightened by the knowledge and the information that has hit me today about this sector, which I can't say that I knew a lot about it, but now I can definitely say that I know more about this sector than I knew before I joined this webinar, and I believe and I gather that's the same for most of you. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, may I take this opportunity on behalf of my colleagues at the Faculty of Law at Manav Rachna University to thank our distinguished speaker for today, Professor Raphael Heffron, for his bringing his great experience and his erudition to this webinar. Professor Heffron, we are indeed grateful that you made time to be with us on a Friday evening. And we hope to continue this dialogue with you and the center at the University of Dundee in the months and years to come. And how can I forget my colleague, my brilliant colleague Shashikant Yadav. Many thanks for so very efficiently moderating this session. It's never easy moderating an online session, and I think you did a wonderful job in holding the whole webinar together. And last but not the least, let me take this opportunity to thank all of you in the audience for having registered and attended this webinar. We truly appreciate your support to this initiative of the Manav Rachna Law School, and we sincerely hope to see you at one of our future webinars. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all a very good evening, and I hope you have a brilliant weekend ahead. Thank you very much. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.